first hub along all of Broadway, and it was 400 years ago that, you can go to the next one, it's hard without doing it yourself. Yeah, it's the first hub, and over 400 years ago the Dutch settlers came and they built their fort at the very bottom of Manhattan and at the southern tip right near the shoreline. And in front of that they created Bowling Green, cleared out the space, which was also Lenape, which was the Native Americans who lived here, the base of their trail, so they were working off somebody else's trail line. And so the focus of my research is how Bowling Green is sort of an origin point for Manhattan growing up and out. So the next slides show the 1609 shoreline. You can go through these. And then when the Dutch came, they filled in. And then the English, the Americans, and what we have today. Let's see, where am I at now? I'm sorry. I guess the next. So what we did for Heather and I, from there we took the first shoreline as a prototype for what the other shorelines could do, and we literally walked this lower shoreline, and we picked sort of the, starting from the Wall Street area all the way down, because Wall Street is the oldest man-made demarcation line that still exists today that we can all reference today. So that's why we started and stopped there. And these are the, we have pictures from the entire walk, but these are our 3 stops. So the next slide is, so we walked the shoreline, and let's see, and actually walking it gives you appreciation of how the boundaries of the island has changed, not just looking at a map, but when you can stand there and see the distance of everything. The next one. Learning the shoreline, sort of the same idea, but we did research about what type of landfill was used, and that will be coming up next, just the diversity in the landfill that was used. And this is, if you go back one, right back here is Bowling Green, and that's Battery Park, and so the shore is quite close there. And the next one is literally, we with duct tape marked it, which I think would be great, not as a permanent project, but for anyone working on this to walk all of it, mark it with biodegradable, not duct tape, we pulled this all out, but go along the entire thing so you can start seeing all the shorelines together. So my proposal, one of my 2 proposals are signage in Battery Park that would have a little bit of text, but mostly be accessible through smartphones, QR codes, AR technology that talk about either the ecology of the time, the people, what the landfill is, future ramifications, like by the time we hit the farthest signage. In Battery Park, that would be the bigger one, and then along the shoreline, smaller, sort of stenciled on the ground, again, stuff that would be biodegradable, and nothing toxic per se. But those will also hopefully have some kind of QR code that with your smartphone you can read. And the next one, this is a sculpture I proposed for the fountain that's within Bowling Green that would be all the tiers, and because it's a fountain, you can have the water, probably time the water somehow, to come up and down. You can go to the next slide. Sort of go up and down, sort of mimicking the tide to show you, revealing the larger shoreline to the original shoreline. And a lot of this shoreline was originally inspired by reading Mannahatta by Eric Sanderson, which is a great resource for anything about New York. So, great. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Heba. And our research of the site and its surroundings led us to the answer to this question. What do garbage, an 82-foot long ship, and thousands of logs have in common? And it turns out that all of them were used as landfill material in Lower Manhattan. So I tried to piece together the contents of the expanding land using a simple information graphic, and I'll briefly walk you through some of our findings. So the land was mostly unmanipulated until the 1660s when the Dutch dug the Broad Canal along today's Broad Street to drain the low-lying swamp that surrounded the area. And then 10 years later, this land was filled, and it was extended to build the Great Dock, which was the city's first stone dock. And then between the mid-18th and early 19th centuries, garbage was sometimes used as fill material, including large quantities of leather scraps and animal bones, until 1797, when the health commissioner banned the dumping of garbage as fill material for fear that it was causing the yellow fever epidemic. And then finally, in 1972, Battery Park City was created from the material excavated from the World Trade Center using 1.2 billion cubic yards of dirt.
Great.
Do you want to start with your slides, Janice?
Yeah, I'm gonna, let's actually start with the video. Okay. Hi, my name is Denise, and it's really nice to be here. First, I want to share a video of the interviews that was conducted at Bowling Green. Some of the willing participants, they share their experiences and offer some insight of how the space is being utilized. So what you're going to see is a short documentary of those interviews using the questions and tips inspired by Kevin Lynch's book called The Image of the City.
New Jersey.
From China.
I come here every day to work.
In New Jersey. I'm from Holland.
I've been living here for almost 3 years. The things that come to mind about Bowling Green would be that it's peaceful and in a really amazing location.
To meet a friend of mine.
Ocean, maybe.
The Museum of American Indians.
Just a green space. You know, there's very few green spaces besides Central Park, so it's always nice to know your green spaces.
It's like Bowling Green, it's very nice place.
Rats.
So I connect one to the other. Battery Park, and I do like the view at Battery Park.
Here, honestly.
It's pretty and it's got some pretty fat pigeons. Those are the fattest pigeons I've ever seen in my life.
There's no squirrels in there, there's rats everywhere. But the sun goes down and they scamper around.
I do not know about the history of Bowling Green.
Oh, it's so happy.
I have no idea.
I do not. I know that they used to bowl in there.
No idea about the history of Bowling Green.
It used to be,
No, I do not know anything about the history at all.
Some areas, but not specifically, just bits and pieces that I've heard about.
I don't know anything about the history.
I know there's a,
Can I just skip the question?
at this point.
Well, actually, it's quite funny because we're in one of the birthplace of New York, and it's actually here sold to the Britons for $24, which is a bit sad because otherwise it would be New Amsterdam instead of New York. And I'm from Amsterdam, so it saddens me that this is in Amsterdam, New York.
No, I have no emotional connection to
Not in particular, no, the things that I have in the gospel.
No, I'm sorry.
Not really. The feeling of the immigrants coming in.
Well, I remember just passing through it, but no fun memories.
Very cool.
the end of New York City for the meeting.
No, but it's nice to have around, except when the rats come out.
It's easy.
Look here. It's my home.
The spring or summer feeling for me.
The word I would use to describe Bowling Green maybe
It's central near the city. It's very easy to come in.
Very relaxed compared to everything around it. Quiet, fresh.
I think my adjectives are not good today. Maybe immigration, something like that.
I would say congested because there are a lot of people in the area.
Peace,
In the morning, it's lovely.
immigration, struggle.
I think it's beautiful.
Struggle and peace at the same time. I don't know.
It's very mixed because it's it's a very small spot of green in a huge complex of lots of buildings and New York Stock Exchange.
Fresh. Fine. Doesn't look like there's too many parks or green spaces here, so it's very nice.
So from the interviews, we found very few people actually know the history to Bowling Green. And up until a few weeks ago, I would have been one of those people. But through research, particularly in Eric Sanderson's book, Mannahatta, I discovered a rich history of New York City. When I began to look at the life of the Lenape, identifying their values and reading folklore passed through generations, it was clear to me that they had an inherent appreciation, a spiritual and moral relationship to the natural world and each other. The Lenape valued body decorations, representing animals believed to have descended from the creature whose name they bore, and felt ties of respect and also kinship and culture. They had a sense of responsibility to their community because they shared land and resources and shelter and their workload. The Lenape worked together to preserve a balanced life. I'm interested in transforming the city into a more historically aware and social cultural environment. I'm proposing a design, a scavenger hunt game that serves as a scaffold for engagement and an opportunity to connect locals and tourists. I will be exploring aspects of game mechanics, particularly role-playing techniques to curate the city. I think history offers means to uncover reality. It presents an explanation of how the present moment operates and provides future knowledge. And I hope by providing historical and naturalistic approaches to this game, that I promote a more ecological relationship with the land. Thank you.
Hello everybody. My name's Lisa and this is Lisa. And the two of us worked on the idea of Bowling Green Park and how we can get more users into it, how we can open it up and get people thinking a little bit differently about it. So when we went down there, we realized that, and a lot of it is due to the fence around it, it seems very closed off, very static, very formal. It's kind of like you don't know if you can go in, you don't know like what you can do about it. So just exploring the site, we wanted to see how we can kind of open this up more. And one of our ideas was to open it up through connecting it to other green spaces in the area. You can go to the next slide. So as we were exploring around Lower Manhattan, we came across this site, which is called Liberty Community Garden. And Lisa and I are both from New York, and we actually never discovered this place before. And it kind of got us thinking about other green spaces in Lower Manhattan and how you can connect a green space which is Bowling Green that's kind of enclosed, and by connecting it to other green spaces, how you can maybe open it up and get people thinking about it differently. So for example, in opposition to the other slide, the garden is always changing. It's accessible, although it does have a gate around it. I mean, the gate is a little bit lower, maybe that has something to do with it. and it's also repurposing and reimaging of an area. That was on the side of Battery Park City. Yeah, on the side of it. So we wanted to create a map that showed all the other various green spaces that Bowling Green was linked to. And you can see that Bowling Green is more or less in the center of Lower Manhattan. So this just got us thinking about all the other green spaces that did exist. And then from this, we thought of having either an event or a tour of the other various green spaces in the area. So we were thinking about the tour, and the benefits of the tour would be the walker would be able to go out and experience the green spaces, to be in the environment, as well as improving health and wellness. And along with the tour, we were thinking of having a booklet designed, which would have a map in it, and then it would also have a picture of each of the green spaces. And when you arrive at one of the green spaces, it would tell you how many steps you've taken or how many miles you've walked from Bowling Green. And then during the tour, in the booklet as well, we would pose questions to the people who are walking on the tour, and it would ask them kind of what they're experiencing in the site, have they come across any wildlife, any birds, what they've seen, heard, or felt.
No.
So this is the map of the tour that we're proposing. So it would start at Bowling Green, and then it would go down around Battery Park, up Battery Park City, and then onto the east side, onto South Street Seaport, and back around again. So it would be about 13 various locations. And once again, we were thinking of this as maybe an event, and then we would create booklets, and people could go and do it themselves if they can't make it to the event or whatnot. And so we wanted to include within the tour larger green spaces or larger parks that people think of when they think of green spaces, such as Battery Park or even the Esplanade in Battery Park City. But as we were kind of discovering these green spaces, we started to think of the idea of how New York City thinks of green spaces and how they kind of push the idea of green spaces. Rather than just a large open park area, you do have green spaces that exist elsewhere. The one on the left is the Winter Garden in the World Financial District, where they have these large palm trees inside this area. And when you're inside it, you do kind of get that feeling of being inside a green space, even though you're inside a building. And then the center image is the Irish Hunger Memorial in Battery Park City, which is it's a memorial, and on top of it, you have this large green space that you kind of walk into when you explore yourself. And then on the right is something interesting that the two of us discovered when we went down to the World Trade Center Memorial. And I had seen a documentary on this prior to visiting the site, and it's on what they call the survivor tree. And it was a tree that was damaged in the bombings, and one man had sort of rescued the tree, and he placed it upstate to be rehabilitated, and then it got damaged in a storm, and then it was rehabilitated again and brought back to life, and now it's planted within the memorial site, and it has a fence around it. So it's just thinking about kind of how we think about ecosystems and green spaces, and how we kind of can memorialize them and think about them a little bit differently. So that's where we currently are.
Fantastic. So that's it for Pratt, I'm assuming, yeah?
Yeah.
Thank you guys. That was wonderful. The last school that we have to present is Penn. Do we have some reps?
My name is Aaron Werner,
Rebecca Hopkins.
and we're from Penn State University. We're here with all of our friends and cohabitants of the architecture building. I wish I was joking more than that, but we actually basically live there. Our two hubs were the 112th and 125th hubs, and the corner of 112th has our friends at Goddard right on the corner, and 125th is an interesting crossroads between where the Harlem community essentially intersects with Broadway and on the greater picture of Columbia, which I'll talk about a little bit later. The analysis we did in terms of making sustainability tangible, we looked at some of the tangible aspects of between the hubs, including rooftop analysis, energy analysis, transportation or the surface analysis, and the subsurface analysis, including the subsystem, including the subway. The rooftop analysis, We use the NYC solar mapping website to obtain some of this data. There's 361,461 square feet of usable roof space between 112th and 125th. You can see the annual savings, and the equivalent of using all this for solar would be like planting 15,375 trees, which is, I think, is pretty significant. Being design-minded and architecturally minded, we wanted to apply this to what we can do with the actual building on the rooftopscape. So that includes the idea of white roofs, cool roofs, wind belts, green roofs, and thinking sustainably with sustainable approaches to a rooftop. The energy, or like the meat of the building, the 19.5 million inhabitants of New York consume the same in a year as all of sub-Saharan Africa, which is a lot. And these highlighted buildings here within 112th to 125th consume over 211 million kilowatt hours of electricity a year. So along the same lines, we looked at how we can retrofit more aspects to the existing buildings, as well as developing strategies for buildings that are newly introduced to the area. The surface analysis. The 400 million gallons of gasoline every day is pretty significant. The 8 million gallons of gasoline a day idling is equivalent to this block of a lake of gasoline, essentially, which is, just to put that in a tangible, a visual is pretty staggering. So to combat that, we looked at alternate forms of transportation, biking, public transit system. I found this graphic, which is really interesting. That's the space it takes cars, that's the space it takes a bus, and that's the space it takes bicycles to do to transport the same number of people, 60 people. The subsurface, we looked at the subway and its effects. It consumes a lot of energy, but nearly 6.5 million people use the system every day. If they drove every day, it would be 347.5 billion kilowatt hours compared to 1.8 billion that the subway uses itself to transport that number of people. This is our actual sites. We can skim through these. It just shows some of the development. Next. Columbia is doing an expansion project up 125th, so this has been an interesting dynamic between the Harlem community and Community Board 9 and Columbia itself, because of the differences between the Columbia people who attend Columbia, who are really literally up on the hill, and the people in Harlem who are down over the hill. There's just a complete line. So thinking about integration was a major part of our designs, along with the idea of making sustainability tangible. This is part of my project.
Just to preface what Aaron just went over, basically, what he had just said was a very, very small percentage of the amount of research our studio has done. That was more of what he has found necessary in his research, but to even begin to cover the amount that we have done would take hours. So basically,
the book, the PDF is posted online for everything if you want to check out the other work. My specific project, we identified what would make this community sustainable, both in terms of green space and sustainably minded, as well as sustainable in terms of cohabitating with Columbia University. So we identified a strong arts community within Harlem, as well as a strong science community. If you go to the next one, that's my specific site, and I'll talk about it in a little bit. But this type of model is what we're trying to do. We're trying to integrate the Harlem community on the basis of arts and sciences, because we felt like sciences was something that community and the research community cared about, and arts are something that the Harlem community cares about. So why not bring those two together and unite them to one thing that they both can care about together? Well, I'll talk a little bit more about our community partners aspect. I identified a community partner called WEACT for Environmental Justice, which is a strong environmental activist group in West Harlem, and that informed some of my design and how I proceeded with my project. Their successes so far had to do with the West Harlem Pierce Park, and what that has given to the community, which it's along the Hudson River on the opposite side of where the Columbia Expansion Project is. So it's a destination close to Fairway Market, which is also a stable institute there. But it's on the other side, so the problem is filtering people to that place, experiencing the rift between that Columbia has provided. And Columbia has been very good about trying to design in a way that opens up their campus a bit more to the public and provides retailing and open sidewalks and stuff like that. But what I want to do, if you continue, is enhance a little bit more the space between the viaduct, the existing Henry Hudson Parkway, and that space that's an interesting point because of visibility. So we're talking about this idea of making sustainability tangible. I chose a site that, by building a building there, and what I'm trying to do is an environmental action building, complete with like a large wind turbine to add to the skyline, and a solar tracking array that I'm calling the Sunflower, that is a physical, visible piece of sustainability that both the students and researchers and our friends from Goddard and friends from Columbia can work at, with students from some of the surrounding schools of the community and community members to educate the young of the Harlem area. So it's a really interesting site in terms of visibility. You'll have visibility of the green roof and the solar tracking way from the viaduct. The street level, the building will have a presence on the street level. This is Columbia's expansion area over there. The Henry Hudson Parkway has a view of the building and what it stands for, as well as people transitioning down past the building into what is the park. I should probably tell you that we're far into our design stages. We have about 3 weeks left until our final reviews, so our research stage is long in the past. This is conceptually how it will be visible, and I just chose to use one form of that visibility in the form of wind turbine. Continue. We can keep going. I came up with I have to change this because I recently found out that it's actually the name of an initiative in State College already. But New LEAF stands for Leaders of Environmental Action for the Future. And that's the type of thing I want to promote within the community of Harlem and the cooperation with Columbia University as well. We keep going, this is just about wind analysis. The top would be like a green roof where there's community gardens as well as education and what a green roof can really do for a building. The top would also have somewhat of a solar tracking array I'm calling the Sunflower. This was part of the design charrette that happened to design the Pierce Park. So I want to provide that meeting space both for researchers and for people of the community and environmental action groups such as We Act to come together to make these big decisions. I'm calling this like an environmental discovery zone where kids will have fun but they'll also be learning. The mechanical piece of the building would tie into the river hopefully for cooling systems and create this overall building that visibly practices what it preaches as a symbol of that tangibility of sustainability.
Okay, so basically what Aaron just talked about was his project, and we had a phase in between the research and the project that he would just present. You can go to the next one. This is an example of one of the urban designs done by one of the groups in our studio, where we were basically all separated after the research and analysis phase to then work with a smaller group to propose in urban design. What was the overall idea, and how could you then incorporate that into each of your individual projects? You would take a certain portion that you were most interested in. So you can go to the next one. So my group, we basically were looking into different aspects of the urban experience and green space, water, noise, etc. So you can go to the next one. This was our urban plan, our master plan on proposing different things that we would like to include. And this is at the 125th Hub. And then this is the building that I'll be focusing on. So although Aaron did say that we only have 3 weeks left, this in comparison to past semesters is a very, very short time span for us to design the building. So we are still in preliminary design, but we don't have a lot of time left. So building uses in the area, the next one, specifically focusing on the cultural buildings. I found that the 2 buildings on the side of that subway stop at 125th kind of culminate those. Next one. So different noise studies in this area. This was actually done by Columbia University, showing that the decibel ratings at the subway in a kitchen in an apartment just right by the site and on the sidewalk were all above 100 decibels, which is all very harmful at very short periods of time. So different noise I did on research was actually from the noise committee chair, and she was talking about the different quiet zones that are in effect in different parks in New York. Next one. And in response to this was actually the protests by a lot of musicians that are being kicked out of those quiet zones. And how people who are in the park, you have very response. Some people love it. Why would you get rid of a gift that they're giving? Or some people are like, I would like to enjoy the noise. Also different research that was done on noise, like subway noise levels that can create hearing loss. I think the actual summary or conclusion was 30 minutes anywhere in the subway at any time would be harmful to the person. But at points on the subway stations, 1.5 minutes would be harmful. So it depends on where you are, and in the subway cars it's worse. So basically a different noise study was actually looking at different types of plant abatement walls that would be self-sustaining on the tracks that came up above the ground. And this is one of the only areas in the whole entire island of Manhattan that the subway does come above ground. And if you are walking in this area, which any Columbia student would be doing, connecting between the 2 campuses, you can't actually have a full-blown conversation when the subway goes by because it completely overtakes the conversation because of the noise level on the sidewalk right there. So this was a different idea. Different potential aspects that could be used. There's this thing called the noise tube that they're trying in Paris where you can actually basically measure the amount of noise and then you'd be aware of how much you're being exposed to, and different types of architecturally related items that you could incorporate into a building to abate that noise inside the space. Next one. So different precedents. I'll just skip through these. Okay, so the site again, skip. My project analysis was basically to create cultural living spaces in this area for the campus and have these cultural zones, which I'm dubbing as cultural zones, which would allow the musicians who are being displaced from these quiet zones and give them a space to create positive noise in the area. That would also be included in this building space, these living spaces. Just project objectives. You can skip that additional show. Okay, so basically proposed program, having the market space on the bottom, I was actually looking into the Harlem, what Harlem was claiming that they're most proud of their culture, and they do talk a lot about markets, and actually in particular I found a lot about an African market, and giving them this space on the lower level, and then as you would go up to have exhibit and gallery spaces, but also have these living spaces be a part of that community, a live-work area in this building. So basically, really rough connecting the street up to the subway and allowing the noise in different aspects of the building. Different perspectives that could be included, connecting these cultural zones. And this was more on an urban scale for our group, what we really wanted to accomplish. Different stakeholders that I was looking at, the Community Board 9, their Arts and Cultural Committee, talking about how they really do want an interactive and integrated area for the students of Columbia and the community to work together and to interact and to allow these parks and hubs and to all work together. And also the noise aspect is obviously a large concern for me. So then we can go to the next one. This is just the last slide. Erin kind of touched on it, that we have a community stakeholders that we've all started focusing on or pulling from, helping to see what they want from the project.
And our projects throughout the studio have many different aspects that took up different research approaches. So I mean, after the keynote speakers, if there's any discussion about any other part of our research, I don't know as much as what my other fellow students know about waste or about water or about air quality. So if there's questions, feel free to open that up. The community partners approach, I think, is valuable for making this somewhat of a real project to us. So we're reaching out to places like Park Space, reaching out to the park or the Office of Long-Term Sustainability and the actual mayor's office. Community Board 9 is the West Harlem Community Board that has all these subcategories of the waterfront, parks, arts, and culture. We act as the environmental activist group and the Columbia itself, as well as the water guys from the waterfront as part of the Vision 2020. So that's where we're at. And
Great.
thanks.
Our studio is a mixture between landscape architecture students and architecture students. And the way that we've approached this semester-long project, so we have 16 weeks. The first 8 weeks we spent just mapping. Each week we would map different things. The first week we mapped context, scale, and history. Then we took a site visit and we came to New York and met with Mary Miss and Nigel from Lincoln Center. And we just kind of got a feel for the neighborhood. And then we did a quick sketch problem the following week where we came back and just put on paper our initial reactions to the site. For the landscape students, it was through landscape or just infrastructure in the site. And for the architecture students, we kind of had a charrette, and just quick designs for the site based on our initial reactions. Then the next week after that, we mapped out water, air, and land. And then we did life, waste, and energy, and food, transportation, and culture. And this week, we've actually completed all of these mappings, and this week we're combining 2 landscape students and 2 architecture students into a group. And we are combining all of our maps. So it's going to be interesting to see what everyone comes up with next Wednesday. But you can go to the next slide. I'm just going to show y'all a couple of my maps that I've done. This was from the water, air, and land. In the top, you can see I've mapped out where all the water is coming from into Manhattan. From the Catskill, Delaware area, and just coming down into Manhattan, which is in red. And then also for water, I wanted to map out permeable material on the site in the neighborhood versus non-permeable material, and just to see that ratio. There is quite a good amount of green space surrounding Lincoln Center Plaza, so that was good to see, but it's still only 14%, I think, versus non-permeable. And then for air, I kind of just did an analysis of cars going through the site and the pace at which they move. So like cars staying still more frequently kind of pollute the air more, in certain areas than faster moving traffic. And then I kind of did an analysis of how many cars are in the neighborhood at any given time and how many trees it would take to offset the CO2 emissions. And each tree represents 100 trees, so it would take a lot of plantings to offset the CO2 emissions in our neighborhood. And then for land, I kind of just did a historical evaluation of how Manhattan has expanded over time and how they filled in along the edge of the water to expand the width of Manhattan. So you can go to the next slide. And then for food, transportation, and culture, there are two farmers markets close to Lincoln Center Plaza, and I mapped out where all the food is coming from. For transportation, I just mapped out the different routes, paying special attention to bike paths, which it's hard to see on the projector, but there are only 2 bike paths that go through our site. So, and then it's also hard to see, but I also mapped out all of the bike routes in all of Manhattan just to compare the percentage that are on our site compared to all of Manhattan. And those are, I'm just trying to focus my analysis on things that interest me dealing with urban sustainability and what I might want to, when we go into designing the project, which is the last 8 weeks of the semester, we actually designed something dealing, for landscape, it's dealing with the landscape, for architecture, dealing with infrastructure, and so I'm really interested in bicycle paths and having more sustainable modes of transportation. And for cultural, I kind of just wanted to do an abstract mapping, sort of the different types of ethnicities that make up the residents of our neighborhood. And then to take it a step further, I wanted, and relate it back to food, I wanted to see, what each culture, what their special vegetable or fruit is for their culture, and maybe sell it at farmers markets or somehow grow it in the neighborhood to just tie all this analysis together. So those are my mappings.
Great.
I'm going to switch files.
We didn't have much time to coordinate, so we only had class on Wednesday night. We only just found out we were doing this.
Are you an architecture or landscape?
I'm sorry, I'm Master's of Architecture.
And you're design and landscape.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, so you can go through a few of these just because we've got a lot of repeats, so in the sake of time, we can just, so that was the proposal of how we broke up this semester. You can keep going. Mapping out the nodes and where they are, history, we keep going. And so we all had a different little take on how to map, and some of us was new to us, so it's been an interesting experience, but we've already talked about land, we talked about water. What's next? So air, we did that, and then some of the ones that she didn't talk about were, the waste, figuring out 4.5 pounds of trash per day, scary numbers. Yeah, it's really frightening, and how the trash is really trucked out of the city, going into Virginia and Pennsylvania, and I'd like to flush out a little bit more on this and talk about that away and how far away is that trash needs to go before it's really dissipated. So you can move on. Energy, looking at the different sources of energy, the users of energy, people, cars, taxis, buildings. Did you talk about energy? One of us did. And so you can move on. Should be life in there. We did, here I tried to look at population. This actually, for me, this was very important. I think the biggest thing that I got out of this was who actually lived there, my demographics, because of site response. It's power singles, 20 to 40-year-olds. This is high-tech people. This is people who are really, maybe they've got a little extra money to spend or whatever. This is the new generation. This is people who are willing to hear about sustainability, people who are willing to do something about sustainability. And one of the things that part of our studio is not only are we making a sustainable ecological response in our design, but we also have a public art piece. That was something that we had talked about. That's the other part of our design, public art piece. You can keep going. This slide here, I tried to think about all of the other visitors that we have to our site who come from all over the world. Is habitat, and I wanted to look at this in linking the patches with Central Park and the Riverside Park, and how Dante Park and Tucker Park could be instrumental in that ecological link. You can move. And I don't want to bore you with all this. Again, culture, we've already covered it. So just to give you an idea of what we've been doing these past 9 weeks. Food, you can keep going. Transportation, stormwater. This is interesting. This helped me develop for my project, my overall design ecological response, and will be dealing with stormwater. You can keep going. And so my overall design is the sink park. And sink park will be, hopefully, if I can figure out how to do it, taking the water and filtering it and creating a buffer for all the stormwater that's in the area. And that will be my ecological response. Not like a sponge, but more of a filtration, like a sink. You can keep going. And then the sink park will be my performing arts and my public art, which would be somehow, I don't know yet, I'm still fleshing it out, that the sink park would be 2 sinks that you would be able to sink into Lincoln Center somehow and get some kind of, either you're walking by, you're getting your synced in on your iPod or your iPad or something. There's an idea there, working on it. So that's all I have for you.
That's great.
That's where we're at.
My name is Joel Lemire. I am a lecturer at MIT. I'm actually co-teaching this course with Azra Akshamian, who is an artist, who is also on the faculty at MIT. The title of the course is Object Geographies, but the subtitle of the course is Disassembly and Reassembly Workshop in Art and Architecture. Now, that seems obvious to me, but maybe it's worth teasing out just a little bit what that means. We do begin with a mapping exercise, and I'll show you that in just a second, which is where we plug in most explicitly with the sort of the BROADWAY 1000 Steps project. The site that we mapped, and I'll show you that, is the Canal Street site, so that we're at the very edge of Chinatown down here. I fear some of our work is a little bit tangentially related only to the BROADWAY 1000 Steps. I think it will inevitably regain orbit around the project by the time we get to the end. But right now we're only a midterm for our course because we started very late and we go until the end of May, so we're barely in the middle. Okay, so bear with me on some of the slides. They won't seem really perfectly relevant, but I assure you they will get back there. So as I said, we start with the mapping, and then after that we do the disassembly portion of the project, where students have, and we've already been through this, have disassembled or actually kind of dissected in a very careful way objects that were found on the site. So the mapping included a kind of cataloging of various objects at various scales, from scales of architectural objects to consumer goods to infrastructural objects as well. It turns out that everybody took on the question of the object at the consumer scale for the disassembly portion of the project. I'll show you a couple images of that in a second. So that dissection, the aim of that dissection is to really scrutinize those objects in really careful detail, situating those objects locally, but also as the loci of larger global networks. Okay, and then finally phase 3, which is the part we haven't gotten to, so I don't have any slides for that at all actually, is going to be the reassembly portion, which is the redesign of an object based on the piece that they've disassembled in a sense. Meaning they will newly conceive design objects that leverage the analysis. The intention is that there will be very intelligent objects embedded with an understanding of the resource use, systems of fabrication and exchange, the use of innovative technology, and so forth. But more importantly, the objects will embody specific cultural and social histories as well, acting as critical interventions through everything. So next slide. Fine. All right, so as I mentioned, we started with a mapping exercise. I did excuse the sort of iconographic representation here, but it was all put together for more rhetorical purposes than actual mapping purposes. But we mapped a lot of the sort of the basic things that are on the site, certainly things like traffic lights and let's see what I have on this slide. Unused telephones and parking meters and waste baskets and street signs and the like. And then next slide. But in conjunction with that sort of obvious set of mapping exercises, students took on slightly less or more obscure mappings as well. So we have, some are kind of predictable. So you have, for instance, the tiling of the elevations based on a set of photographs as a kind of pure catalog of the site. But then you also have a student, in this case Chris Miller is one of the students, who did a really exhaustive catalog of the different kinds of lighting that are on the site, including architectural lighting, and more interestingly, much more ad hoc types of lighting, shared lighting, power outlets that were used by multiple stores and the like. And so he started to map all of those sorts of
let's say, much more idiosyncratic conditions on the site as part of his exercise. Okay, next. So there were those more idiosyncratic mappings. There were a whole catalog of those as well. So there were only 5 students in the course, but we did 5 different kinds of mapping. And then after that, they started to take on analysis of that mapping exercise. And so you have here the analysis by Toshi Ihara, whose mapping exercise was actually trying to draw through all of the signage along this entire site. And then, if you can see up at the very top, that's an illustration of sort of a drawing of the sign. And then in gray, I believe, is the portion of the sign which is in Chinese lettering, and in white in English lettering. And so his analysis started to take on the question of where moments of the relative balance between English and Chinese lettering changed as a kind of description of the softer boundaries of Chinatown, so to speak, right? The moments where suddenly the balance of power shifts. And you can see here that there's a little bit, a little red portion right over there is our moments where it's predominantly Chinese lettering on the site. Next. So in addition to that, we have another analysis which emerged directly through our conversation with Wellington Chen, who is the executive director of the Chinatown Partnership, who we were lucky enough to be put in contact with, who started to tell us about some of the specific and interesting characteristics of that portion of Chinatown, which include the fact that there aren't that many chain stores. And his claim is that the efficiencies of the way that local businesses use their architectural space prohibits chain stores from coming in because they're so much more packed and dense in terms of their retail usage than traditional places would be. So this is the work of Kelly Shaw, who's beautiful drawings, trying to analyze some of the kinds of objects and the amount of space that are used inside one of these shops. And then you go to the next slide. And then that in comparison to a much more typical retail establishment. And, you know, I say the word is still out exactly where this analysis goes and what the conclusions are going to be, but I think even just prima facie, it's pretty clear that there's a distinct difference between the kind of densities in one and the densities in the other. Okay, next slide. Okay, and this is the first slide that starts to speak to what the kind of emerging obsession that we have in the class is, which is about the informal systems of the place. I mentioned those briefly in terms of the ad hoc power usage, but in the other kind of informal system, which is pretty interesting to us, is the economies and distribution of counterfeit goods in the site. This again emerged from part of the conversation that we had with Wellington Chen, who said actually rather bluntly that the sale of counterfeit goods is now the primary driver for tourists to come into Chinatown, more so even than restaurants and other normal retail. And so we took that as just like a sign that we ought to look into it a little bit more specifically. We became pretty obsessed pretty quickly. Next slide. And so one of my students, Catherine Winfield, started to trace some of the resources of these goods and some of the places that all of their pieces come from, and analyze certain characteristics among different types of bags. And the kind of amazing, though, to caution you, very preliminary conclusion to part of this work is that there's a greater correlation between the risk that vendors take and the cost of these counterfeit goods than the original value of the so-called authentic product and the cost of the good, which is to say, bags that are much harder to transport or already have an embedded logo that is harder to hide are the more expensive bags, as opposed to the ones that like have a higher brand value, like the Chanel over the Tory Burch. I've learned all sorts of brand names at this point in my life. Okay, next slide. Okay, so that you could call back one more. All right, so that you could call the end of the kind of mapping portion of the course, and then we sort of head directly into part 2 of the course, which is the disassembly or dissection piece that I was telling you about. The idea of the entire course is to focus on the objects as this locus of sort of global networks, and so clearly we all chose objects that we would start to dig into in great detail. Each has a definition of the specific place and is the locus of the larger networks, as I said. We get there through pulling these objects apart. So here is a counterfeit Chanel bag. Now the next slide. And and obviously its constituent parts. We just did this, so again, we don't have any conclusions about this, and we haven't done all of the mapping of it, but I think it's interesting just to learn from its pieces. And the next slide. Actually, here's one of two dissected Rolex watches. Rolex in quotation marks, obviously. We're not going to pull up our real Rolex watches, though we did contact Rolex to see if they'd give us one. They would not. Out of luck. Neither Chanel. Okay, so this is one of the dissected Rolex watches. So we're just beginning to learn the lessons about it, and I think it's pretty interesting. I won't talk to you in great detail about some of the lessons learned, but I think there's one really interesting piece of this thing, which is maybe a little bit hard to see, so I'm going to have to walk over and point at it here. This is a date dial, so there are dates, right, listed on that, so that, you know, for a watch that shows the date through the face, you can read it. If you'll notice the face here, there's actually no opening for that date to be presented, so the mechanism that they use in that watch is actually a higher quality mechanism than can be shown through the face of the watch. But because of its sort of mimetic character, the fact that it needs to look like this Rolex, it actually devalues the mechanism through the process of, for its sort of, let's say, call it semiotic value, right? So that it can represent a Rolex better, which I think is a really interesting way to start characterizing some of the things that we're learning when we look forward. Okay. So it speaks to this, again, the complexity between functional and semiotic value generally. So you have a couple of counterfeit bags that we're doing, Rolexes that we're doing, a Bulgari watch, and then a Statue of Liberty lighter and a couple of toys as well. So it's sort of a broad range of things that we're doing. Okay, next image. Okay, so then I'm going to conclude with just two images of things that my students did not do, but describe the projectives of the course, and I think where it starts to come back into these questions of sustainability and resources and infrastructure and the like. So we have here an image from Mio Benani, who is actually another MIT professor who will be giving a seminar with my students in a couple weeks. And his great website, sourcemap.com, for those of you that don't know, it's really interesting. It's an attempt to find mapping mechanisms for actually doing almost exactly what we're talking about, which is to figure out where all the pieces of a single object come from. Right? So you have here a laptop computer. You see each its materials and resources, but also where it is fabricated, where it is shipped from, and assembled and manufactured, and the like. And so all of our students are now embarking on this portion. They call it the reassembly portion of the project, where they start to think about all of these larger relationships in a critical way, as opposed to just as a sort of a purely informational capacity. And this is like a perfect illustration, the very definition of the idea of the larger global networks into which an object sits. And then finally, my last slide here, for those of you who haven't seen it, this is an image by Thomas Thwaites. It's called The Toaster Project. Does everybody know this book? It actually became relatively popular over the last year or so. It just came out in 2011, but I mean, I think he's been on like Jon Stewart and things like that, right, talking about it. But essentially the premise of the book is that he built his own toaster from scratch using no given materials or industrial use materials. So he had to figure out a way to make the plastic, which is why it was terrible, how to make the filament out of mined ores, and all of that sort of really complex stuff. It speaks to the idea of an object, certainly that has a kind of self-awareness built into it. So that's where we're heading with our course, is to start designing things that have that kind of logic embedded. That's it. Cool. So that's...
I'm Howard Chambers, and unfortunately, this is probably going to take a bit longer, so Glenn and I are going to go through and show you how it works, and maybe you can do it on the bus or not on the bus.
Yeah. So we developed this tool for the end of this wonderful program, but as we said, we've run out of time. But we really do believe it's a good exercise to exchange ideas among students or communicating ideas across disciplines. So we're going to role play this little concept of speed idea dating for you, and then you can use it at your leisure later. Hopefully the little prompts that we've included in the book might be useful to teams that are just beginning to design right now. They might be useful for students at Penn State that have already designed a lot. So,
And by the way, we're from Parsons. We're in this brand new program called Transdisciplinary Design. It's an MFA program. So a lot of what we do is we look at ecologies, we look at architecture, infrastructure, look at systems, a lot of systems thinking, and scalar approach. So a lot of the wonderful stories that we heard earlier are kind of how we like to think about things and think about reframing situations.
So, without further ado, we're going to give you the instructions on how to use this later. So, in a group of random students, you would mix around, and these little sessions would take about, you can decide whether it's a 5 or a 10-minute engagement, and you want to repeat these engagements about 6 times. So, the exercise that we had scheduled would have been about an hour.
And you can pretend you're from a different school. We have a little thing here that you can circle what hub you're studying, and we were hoping that you could interact with some other schools, so we'll do a little role play.
Yeah. So, if the bell started and I was from Parsons and you're from...
I'm from MIT.
Oh, great. Let's sit down, Howie. Okay, so...
My name's Howard.
Oh, great. So I'm going to write down Howard's name in the first 5 minutes. Howard is going to pitch her idea to me, so I'll get the gist of it.
Well, Bland, I've been looking around Canal Street, and it's really has no green areas, but I've been thinking about the habitats and ecologies of the birds, and I've been looking at all of the lampposts and the other pieces in the environment that birds use for their nests.
Excellent. So Howard has pitched her idea in like a minute to me. And then, in the remaining 4 minutes of this little engagement, I would ask her this question. So, Howard, getting the citizens of New York City engaged to become the generators of change is the goal of this project. So, what means would you use to get people involved with lampposts and...
Wow, that's really interesting. What would I do? Well, maybe I could put little decals or something on eye level so people look up and they think about that. And maybe even, I don't know, maybe I could even put a bird for Twitter and have that connect people to this idea that I'm researching.
Wonderful. So Howard's writing these notes down on her page, and then a magical bell would ring, or you'd have music playing that stops, and then we switch. So I'm pitching my project to her.
Bland, what's your last name?
Hope.
Okay.
Oh gosh, and I'm from Parsons. Okay. So briefly, my idea is, we're working on 14th Street, and we're looking at the, auditory environment of that landscape, and thinking about how it impacts people's cognitive abilities.
Wow. So how would you get citizens of New York engaged in that?
I think I'd maybe develop I don't know, maybe develop an app or something, so when you're listening to your music, every once in a while it beeps, and you have to take your earphones off and actually listen to what's around you.
No, but you could also consider, there's a lot of vendors around there. Maybe the vendors and the streetcar people, they also rent out headphones.
Wonderful. Now, and it's done. Oh my gosh. Those are your sessions. So, we think this is a great way just to get to the good stuff really fast and exchange ideas and
distill your ideas.
I encourage you to use it at your leisure in a different session maybe. So, that's speed idea dating in a nutshell.
We spent a lot of time and energy putting these together. Please use them.